July 7, 2021. Dane County, Wisconsin. Chandler Halderson reported his parents missing. Bart and Krista, both in their 50s, hadn't been seen in days. Chandler seemed worried, said they'd gone to their cabin. But police were suspicious immediately. Something about his story didn't add up. His timeline was off. His demeanor was wrong. Too calm for someone whose parents had vanished. And what investigators would discover over the next few weeks would shock Wisconsin. Would reveal a level of evil that's hard to comprehend. A son who valued his lives more than his parents' lives. This case will break your heart. And it has been terrifying the whole of America. If you believe some people are born evil, like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The Chandler Halderson case shows how lies can lead to unspeakable horror. Chandler Halderson was 23 years old in July 2021. Still lived with his parents in Windsor, Wisconsin, a suburb of Madison. Nice area, quiet, safe, the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where families raise kids, where nothing bad ever happens. Except something bad had happened. Something terrible. Bart and Krista Halderson had disappeared, and their son Chandler was the one reporting it. Bart Halderson was 50 years old, worked in finance, had a good job, made decent money, provided for his family, was responsible, reliable, the kind of man who didn't just disappear without telling anyone. Krista was 53, worked in healthcare, was dedicated to her job, to her patients, to her family, also reliable, also responsible. Both Bart and Krista were the type of people who'd call if they were going to be late, who'd keep in touch, who'd never just vanish. But they had vanished. And that's why police were suspicious of Chandler's story from the very beginning. Chandler told deputies his parents had left on July 2nd, 5 days earlier, said they'd driven to their family cabin in Langlade County, up north, about 2 hours away, said they were supposed to be back by now, but weren't answering calls, weren't responding to texts. This was unlike them, very unlike them. Bart and Krista were communicative, responsible, would never ignore their sons. Chandler said he was worried, said he needed help finding them, seemed concerned, but deputies weren't convinced. Detective Doug Welch was one of the first investigators on the case. He looked at Chandler Halderson and immediately felt something was wrong. Chandler's demeanor was off. He wasn't panicked enough, wasn't emotional enough, wasn't acting like someone whose parents had mysteriously vanished. He was too calm, too controlled, too rehearsed, like he was playing a role, like he'd practiced what to say. Red flags everywhere. The timeline didn't make sense either. Chandler said his parents left July 2nd. It was now July 7th. 5 days. Why wait 5 days to report them missing? Most people would call police after 24 hours. Maybe 48. But 5 days? Chandler's explanation was vague. Said he thought they were just enjoying their cabin. Thought they'd be back. But when they didn't return, he got worried. The explanation was weak. Didn't add up. Made deputies more suspicious. Deputies asked more questions. Where exactly is this cabin? What's the address? When did you last speak to your parents? What were they driving? Chandler answered, but his answers kept shifting. Small details changing. The story evolving. This is a sign of deception. When people tell the truth, their story stays consistent. When they lie, they have to remember what they said. Have to adjust. Have to keep track. Chandler was doing this. Right in front of deputies. Chandler showed them texts. From his mother. Said she'd been texting him. That's how he knew they were okay initially. But now she'd stopped responding. The texts looked legitimate at first glance. But something about them felt wrong. The language, the phrasing, they didn't sound like a mother texting her son. They sounded like someone pretending to be a mother. Deputies took note. Would investigate further. What about you, Chandler? What have you been doing? Where have you been? Chandler said he'd been home, at the family house in Windsor, waiting for his parents to return. He said he worked remotely for SpaceX, the rocket company, could work from anywhere. So he'd been home, working, playing video games in his free time, just living normally, waiting for mom and dad to come back. But this too would turn out to be a lie. Chandler didn't work at SpaceX. Never had. That was just one of many lies Chandler told about his life. Deputies said they'd investigate, would check the cabin, would try to locate Bart and Krista, would follow up. Chandler thanked them, said he just wanted his parents home safe, said he was worried, but deputies weren't buying it. Their instincts were screaming that something was very wrong, that this young man knew more than he was saying, that he might be responsible for whatever happened to his parents. They just didn't know how right they were, didn't know the horror that was about to be uncovered, didn't know that Bart and Krista Halderson weren't at any cabin, weren't on any trip, were dead, had been dead for days, and their son knew exactly where they were. As Chandler left the sheriff's office that day, deputies started working the case immediately, called Bart's employer. He hadn't shown up for work since July 1st, hadn't called in, hadn't given notice, just stopped coming. This wasn't like Bart. He was reliable, professional, would never just not show up. Called Krista's workplace. Same story. She'd been a no-show since July 1st. Hadn't called, hadn't explained, just vanished. Both parents. Both missing since the same day. Both responsible people who'd never do this. Red flags multiplied. Deputies also called the cabin. The one Chandler said his parents went to. Spoke to the property owner. Asked if Bart and Krista had been there. The answer was no. No one had been at the cabin. It was empty. Hadn't been used recently. Bart and Krista never arrived. Never checked in. Chandler's entire story was falling apart. His parents never went to any cabin. So where were they? And why was Chandler lying? The investigation was about to intensify. About to uncover evidence of unspeakable evil. About to reveal what Chandler Halderson had really done to his parents. To understand what happened to Bart and Krista Halderson, you need to understand their son Chandler. Because Chandler Halderson wasn't who people thought he was. Wasn't who his parents thought he was. His entire life was a fabrication. A web of lies. So elaborate, so detailed, that he'd fooled everyone for years. His parents, his girlfriend, his friends, everyone. And when those lies were about to be exposed, Chandler made a terrible decision. A decision that would destroy his family forever. Chandler Halderson told everyone he worked at SpaceX, the rocket company founded by Elon Musk. Said he worked in IT, remotely, from Wisconsin, made good money, had an important position. This impressed everyone. SpaceX was prestigious, cutting edge, exciting. Working there meant you were smart, talented, going places. Chandler's girlfriend Kat was proud of him. His friends were envious. His parents were thrilled their son had such a great job. Everyone believed him. Why wouldn't they? Why would someone lie about something like that? But Chandler wasn't just lying. He was living a complete fantasy. The truth was Chandler had never worked at SpaceX, had never even applied, had never been to California where SpaceX is headquartered. The entire thing was fiction, made up, a lie he told and maintained for months, maybe years. He'd show people fake pay stubs, fake work emails, would talk about projects, about meetings, about coworkers, all invented, all fake. Chandler was so committed to the lie that he'd created an entire false identity around it. And everyone believed him. Chandler also told his parents he was finishing his college degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a respected school. Said he was studying computer science. He was about to graduate. After years of coursework, he was finally finishing. His parents were so proud, had supported him through college. Financially, emotionally, were excited to see him walk across that stage, get his diploma, launch into his career. They believed their son was months away from graduating, from becoming successful, from making them proud. But it was all lies. Chandler wasn't enrolled at UW-Madison, hadn't been for years, had never actually attended as a degree-seeking student. Every report card he'd shown his parents was fake. Every story about classes was invented. Every update about professors and exams was fiction. Chandler had been pretending to be a college student, while really doing nothing, just living at home, playing video games, lying, and getting away with it for years. But the lies went even deeper. Chandler had never graduated high school, never earned his diploma, had dropped out, or been expelled. The details aren't entirely clear, but what is clear is that Chandler had no education beyond high school level. No degree, no credentials, no qualifications. Yet he'd convinced everyone he was a college student about to graduate, about to launch into a career at a major insurance company. Because that was another lie. Chandler told his family he had a job offer from American Family Insurance, a major company headquartered in Madison. Good salary, benefits, career opportunity. He just needed to finish his last few college courses. Then he'd start. His parents were ecstatic. Their son was launching into a stable professional career, had his whole future ahead of him. Everything was falling into place, except none of it was real. American Family Insurance had never heard of Chandler Halderson, had never interviewed him, never offered him employment. This too was completely fabricated. Chandler also claimed he was enrolled in scuba diving certification courses, said he wanted to become a dive instructor, travel the world, teach diving in exotic locations. This was his backup plan. If the insurance career didn't work out, he'd dive. His girlfriend Kat thought this was exciting, romantic, adventurous. Imagine Chandler teaching diving in the Caribbean, on tropical beaches, living an exciting life. But like everything else, it was a lie. Chandler wasn't enrolled in any scuba courses, wasn't getting certified, wasn't planning to dive anywhere. Just another story to make himself seem interesting, successful, going somewhere. So who was Chandler Halderson really? A 23-year-old man living with his parents, who'd dropped out of high school, who had no job, no education, no prospects, no future, who spent his days playing video games in the basement, who lived off his parents' generosity while contributing nothing, who'd been lying to everyone for years, about everything, and who'd gotten very comfortable with those lies, had built his entire identity on fiction, on being someone he wasn't. But those lies were about to catch up to him. And when they did, Chandler would do something unthinkable. By June 2021, cracks were starting to show. Bart Halderson was asking questions, getting suspicious. Chandler had been finishing college for a long time. Years. Why hadn't he graduated yet? When exactly was graduation? When was he starting that insurance job? The timeline didn't make sense. Things weren't adding up. Bart wasn't accusing Chandler of lying. Not yet. But he wanted verification. Wanted to understand what was really happening. Wanted to see paperwork. Wanted proof. And this terrified Chandler. Bart made a decision that would seal his fate. He scheduled a meeting at UW-Madison with administrators, would go there himself, in person, would verify that Chandler was actually enrolled, actually about to graduate, would see transcripts, would talk to advisors, would get the truth. Bart wasn't trying to catch his son in a lie. He just wanted confirmation, wanted to understand the situation, wanted to be prepared to help Chandler transition from college to career. It was a reasonable thing for a father to do, responsible even. But this meeting would expose everything, would reveal that Chandler had been lying for years, that nothing he'd said was true, that his entire life was fake. The meeting was scheduled for July 1st, 2021, just days away. When Chandler learned about it, he panicked. If his father went to UW-Madison, the truth would come out. The university would tell Bart that Chandler wasn't enrolled, had never been enrolled, that there was no degree, no graduation coming, no record of him even being a student. And then what? Bart would confront Chandler, demand explanations. The lies would collapse. The fake life would crumble. Chandler would be exposed as a fraud, a failure, a liar, a dropout living in his parents' basement, pretending to be successful. The humiliation would be unbearable. His parents would kick him out, would stop supporting him financially. His girlfriend Kat would leave him. His friends would abandon him. Everyone would know he'd been lying, that he was nobody, nothing, a high school dropout with no job and no future. Chandler's entire identity was built on lies. Without those lies, who was he? Nobody. And Chandler couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept that. So he started thinking about how to stop that meeting, how to prevent his father from going, how to keep the lies alive. And the solution he came up with was evil, was unthinkable, was murder. Chandler decided his father had to die, had to be eliminated, before July 1st, before that meeting, before the truth came out. If you believe some people are born evil, like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The Chandler Halderson case shows how far someone will go to protect a lie. July 1st, 2021, a Thursday, the day Bart Halderson had scheduled his meeting at UW-Madison. The day he planned to verify Chandler's enrollment, to see his transcripts, to understand when graduation would happen. Bart had no idea this meeting would never occur. Had no idea his son was planning something terrible. Had no idea that this would be his last day alive. Because Chandler couldn't let that meeting happen. Couldn't let his father discover the truth. And Chandler had decided what he had to do, what he was willing to do, to keep his lies hidden, to protect his fake life. Murder. That morning seemed normal. Bart was home, working from his home office. He'd been working remotely since COVID. His job in finance could be done from anywhere. So he worked from home, in his office, doing his job, providing for his family, planning to take a break later, to drive to Madison, to the university, to that meeting. He had no idea Chandler was planning to kill him, had no idea his son had bought a gun, had decided that murder was better than exposure, better than admitting he'd been lying for years. Krista was at work, at her healthcare job, wouldn't be home until evening. She had no idea what was about to happen. No idea that her husband would be dead before she got home. No idea that she'd be next. That Chandler had decided both parents had to die. Because Krista would figure it out. Would know something was wrong when Bart didn't come home. Would call police. Would expose everything. So she had to die too. Both parents. Both eliminated. This is what Chandler had decided. This is the solution he'd chosen. Murder. Double murder. Of his own parents. At some point that afternoon, Chandler went to where the gun was kept. His father's gun. Bart owned firearms. Kept them in the house. For protection. For sport. Normal gun ownership. Chandler knew where they were. Had access. He took a rifle. Loaded it. Prepared to kill. There's no evidence Chandler hesitated. No sign he struggled with the decision. No indication he felt guilt or fear. He'd decided. His father had to die. So he'd make it happen. Cold. Calculated. Evil. Chandler went upstairs. Or to wherever Bart was working. Found his father. Probably at his desk. Working on his computer. On a call maybe. Focused on his job. Not paying attention to Chandler. Not suspecting anything. Why would he? This was his son. His child. Someone he'd raised. Supported. Loved. Protected. Bart had no reason to fear Chandler. No reason to think he was in danger. And that's when Chandler shot him. From behind. In the back. Bart never saw it coming. Never had a chance to defend himself. To fight back. To run. His own son. The child he'd raised and supported for 23 years, had murdered him, in cold blood, in their home. Bart Halderson died from a gunshot wound to the back. The bullet caused massive trauma. He died quickly, probably didn't know what happened, didn't have time to process that his son had killed him. Small mercy maybe, but the betrayal was absolute. Total. A father murdered by his son. For what? To hide lies about college? About fake jobs? The motive was so trivial, so stupid, so evil. Bart did nothing to deserve this. Just wanted to verify his son's enrollment. Just wanted to understand the situation. And for that, Chandler killed him. Now Chandler had a body. His father's body. Dead in the house. Blood everywhere. Evidence everywhere. He should have called 911. Should have confessed. Should have faced consequences. But Chandler didn't. Instead, he started planning. Started thinking about how to cover this up. How to hide what he'd done. How to make his father disappear. And he knew he had another problem. Krista would be home soon. From work. She'd see Bart's body. Would call police. Chandler would be caught immediately. There was only one solution. Krista had to die too. Both parents. Both eliminated. Both hidden. Then Chandler could create a story. Make them disappear. Blame someone else. Get away with it. Krista came home that evening. Probably called out to Bart. Expected him to be there. Working in his office. Or watching TV. Ready for dinner. Ready to talk about their days. Normal evening routine. But Bart didn't answer. Because Bart was dead. And Chandler was waiting. Waiting to kill his mother. Waiting to complete the murders. Waiting to eliminate the only witness. When Krista found Chandler, or when Chandler confronted her, he shot her too. Killed his mother. The woman who'd given birth to him. Raised him. Supported all his lies for years. Believed in him when she shouldn't have. Loved him unconditionally. Chandler murdered her. In their home. In cold blood. Without hesitation. Krista tried to defend herself. Evidence would later suggest she fought. Tried to stop Chandler. Tried to survive. But she couldn't. Chandler was bigger. Stronger. Had a gun. Krista died from her injuries. Another parent dead. Another life stolen. Another person who did nothing wrong except believe their son. Except love him. Except support him. And for that, Chandler killed her. Now he had two bodies. His parents. Both dead. Both murdered. Both lying in the house. In pools of blood. This was the reality of Chandler's decision. This was the consequence of his lies. But Chandler felt nothing. No remorse. No guilt. No horror at what he'd done. Just calculation. Just planning. Just thinking about the next step. Chandler had to dispose of the bodies. Had to make his parents disappear. Had to create a story that would explain their absence. Had to cover his tracks. Make it look like they'd left voluntarily. Gone somewhere. Were still alive. Then no one would suspect murder. No one would suspect him. Chandler thought he was smart enough to get away with this. Thought he could fool police. Fool investigators. Fool everyone. He was wrong. But he'd try. And what he did next would shock investigators. Would horrify the community. Would prove just how evil Chandler Halderson really was. Because disposing of his parents' bodies wasn't enough. Chandler would do something even worse. Something that would make this case one of the most disturbing family murders in American history. After murdering his parents, Chandler Halderson faced a problem. Two bodies. In his house. He needed them gone. Needed to make it look like Bart and Krista had left voluntarily. Gone somewhere. So no one would suspect murder. What Chandler did next would shock even experienced homicide detectives. Would prove just how cold. How calculated. How utterly evil he really was. On July 2nd, Chandler went shopping. Drove to local hardware stores. Home improvement stores. Bought specific items. A reciprocating saw. The kind used in construction. With powerful blades capable of cutting through wood. Through metal. Through bone. He also bought cleaning supplies. Industrial strength bleach. Heavy-duty garbage bags. Tarps. Duct tape. Everything needed for a very specific purpose. A horrific purpose. Chandler paid with credit cards. Normal transactions. The cashiers had no idea what these items would be used for. Just another customer. Another sale. But those receipts would later become evidence. Would prove premeditation. Would show Chandler had planned what he was about to do. What Chandler did with that saw is almost too horrific to describe. But it needs to be told. Because people need to understand the level of evil involved here. Chandler brought his parents' bodies to the basement. The same basement where he'd spent countless hours playing video games. Living his fake life. Maintaining his lies. Now it would become something else. A crime scene, a place of desecration, a place where a son would do the unthinkable to his own parents. Chandler used the reciprocating saw to dismember his parents, cut their bodies into pieces, arms, legs, torsos, heads. He systematically took apart the two people who'd given him life, who'd raised him, who'd loved him unconditionally, who'd supported his lies even when they shouldn't have. The process took hours, was messy, blood everywhere, tissue, bone fragments. The basement was soaked in evidence. But Chandler kept going, methodically, coldly, like he was doing a chore, not desecrating his parents' bodies. Neighbors would later report hearing power tools, a saw running in the Halderson garage or basement, late at night on July 2nd and 3rd, for extended periods, loud, unusual. Some thought Chandler was doing home improvement projects. Others thought it was odd but didn't investigate, didn't call police, just noticed and moved on. But what they were hearing was murder's aftermath. Was Chandler cutting up his parents? The sound of evil, happening right in their neighborhood, while they watched TV or slept, while life continued normally just houses away. Evil was operating behind closed doors. Other neighbors reported seeing fires, large fires in the Halderson backyard, on July 2nd and 3rd. Bigger than normal, hotter. The smoke was thick, dark. The smell was strange, not like burning wood or leaves. Something else, something organic, something sickening. But again, neighbors didn't call police, didn't investigate, just assumed Chandler was burning yard waste or garbage. But he wasn't. He was burning evidence. Clothes soaked in blood, tarps covered in tissue, items that couldn't be disposed of normally, things that had to be destroyed, maybe smaller body parts too, pieces that could be incinerated, made to disappear. The fires were destroying evidence, covering up murder. Once the bodies were dismembered, Chandler bagged the parts, used multiple garbage bags, heavy-duty ones, layered them, used duct tape to seal everything, prevent leakage, prevent smell, made packages he could transport, could carry to his vehicle, could dump in different locations. This is what Chandler did over the next several days. Made multiple trips to different areas around Dane County, disposing of his parents piece by piece. Chandler threw some parts in the Wisconsin River, near Sauk City, about 30 miles from Windsor. He drove there at night, probably under cover of darkness, threw bagged body parts into the water, thought they'd sink, decompose, never be found, thought the river would hide his crimes forever. But bodies float. Eventually, the gases from decomposition make them buoyant. What Chandler threw in the river would resurface, would be discovered, would be identified through DNA. His plan would fail. Other parts Chandler dumped in wooded areas, rural locations, off remote roads, in forests, in fields, places where people rarely went, where remains might not be found for months or years, where animals might scatter them further, where nature might consume them. Chandler was strategic, methodical, trying to ensure his parents' bodies could never be fully recovered, could never be identified, could never be connected back to him. He scattered the remains across the county, made sure they weren't all in one place, made sure finding one piece wouldn't lead to finding others. Some parts were never found, are still missing today, probably burned in those backyard fires, reduced to ash and bone fragments that dispersed in the wind, or buried somewhere undiscovered, hidden so well they'll never be recovered. Bart and Krista Halderson couldn't be fully put back together even after being found, couldn't be made whole again. Even in death, they'd been fragmented, destroyed, scattered, by their own son, for no reason that makes sense to normal people, for lies, for ego, for evil. Between disposal trips, Chandler cleaned the house, scrubbed the basement with bleach, used industrial cleaners, tried to eliminate every trace of blood, every trace of what he'd done. He thought he could make the crime scene disappear, thought if he cleaned thoroughly enough, no one would ever know what happened in that basement. But forensic science is powerful. Blood absorbs into materials, into concrete, into wood, into drywall. Even after extensive cleaning, traces remain, can be detected, can be revealed with luminol. Chandler didn't know this, thought he'd erased the evidence, thought he was safe. He was wrong. For nearly a week after the murders, Chandler lived alone in that house, alone with the knowledge of what he'd done, alone with his parents dead and dismembered, alone with their remains scattered across Dane County. But Chandler acted normal, texted his girlfriend Kat, talked to friends, made plans, played video games, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just murdered his parents, like everything was fine. This ability to compartmentalize, to separate murder from daily life, to function normally while harboring such evil. This made Chandler one of the most chilling killers Wisconsin had ever seen. And his lies were about to be exposed, his crimes about to be discovered, and justice about to be delivered. If you believe some people are born evil, like share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The Chandler Halderson case shows how far someone will go to protect a lie. On July 8, 2021, 1 week after the murders, investigators arrived at the Halderson home. They had a search warrant. Chandler's story about his parents going to a cabin had fallen apart. The cabin owner said no one had been there. Bart and Krista's employers said they'd been no-shows for a week. Their car was at the airport, but there were no flight records. Nothing added up. Police knew something was wrong. Knew Chandler was lying. Now they needed evidence. And they were about to find it. Chandler had agreed to the search. Seemed cooperative. Said go ahead, search anywhere, nothing to hide. This was either genuine innocence or extraordinary arrogance. In Chandler's case, it was arrogance. He believed his cleaning had been effective. Believed he'd erased the evidence. Believed police wouldn't find anything. He was catastrophically wrong, because the Halderson house was full of evidence. Evidence of murder. Evidence of dismemberment. Evidence that would destroy Chandler's lies and prove he'd killed his parents. The forensic team brought luminol, a chemical that reacts with blood. Glows blue-green under UV light even after extensive cleaning. Can detect blood that's been scrubbed, bleached, wiped away. Blood invisible to the naked eye. The team went straight to the basement, Chandler's domain, where he'd spent so much time gaming, and where he'd dismembered his parents. They sprayed luminol on the floor, turned off the lights, turned on UV lights, and the basement lit up like a Christmas tree. Blood, everywhere, glowing blue-green, despite Chandler's cleaning, despite the bleach, despite his efforts. The blood remained, was evident, was proof that extreme violence had occurred in this basement, that people had bled here, had died here, had been cut apart here. The patterns told a story. Blood spatter, drag marks, pools where bodies had lain. The basement was a crime scene, and Chandler's cleaning hadn't hidden that fact. The forensic team documented everything. Photographed, measured, collected samples. This was evidence that would convict him. They found more. In the garage, investigators found the reciprocating saw. The one Chandler had purchased on July 2nd. He'd tried to clean it, wiped it down, but biological material remained. In crevices, on the blade, tissue, bone fragments, microscopic pieces. But enough to test, to identify, to prove this saw had been used to cut through human remains. Through Bart and Krista Halderson. This was the murder weapon, or at least the dismemberment tool, and it was in Chandler's possession. Investigators seized Chandler's computer, laptop, phone, would examine them forensically, would recover his internet history, his searches, his digital footprint. What they found was damning, devastatingly damning. Chandler had Googled things, lots of things, in the days after the murders. Search terms that proved guilt, that proved consciousness of what he'd done. How to dispose of a body. Body disposal methods. Can cadaver dogs detect bodies underwater? How long does DNA last? Decomposition rate. How to clean blood from concrete. These searches were time-stamped. from July 1st through July 6th, right after the murders, while Chandler was dismembering his parents, while he was disposing of remains, while he was cleaning the crime scene. He'd Googled how to commit murder and get away with it, then tried to follow those instructions. But he'd left the digital evidence, the searches that proved premeditation, that proved he knew what he was doing, that proved guilt. Investigators also found receipts from hardware stores, dated July 2nd, for the reciprocating saw, for industrial bleach, for heavy-duty garbage bags, for tarps, for everything Chandler had used in the dismemberment and cover-up. He'd paid with credit cards, left a paper trail, documentation of his purchases, of when he bought them, right after his parents disappeared, right when he would have needed them for dismemberment. The receipts connected everything. The saw in his garage, the purchases on July 2nd, the timeline of the murders, everything linked together, everything proved guilt. They found Bart and Krista's cell phones in the house, not with them. If they'd really gone to a cabin or flown somewhere, they'd have taken their phones. But the phones were home, in drawers, abandoned. This contradicted Chandler's entire story. His parents hadn't gone anywhere. They'd never left. They died here, in this house. The phones proved it. Investigators examined the texts Chandler had shown them, the ones supposedly from his mother. Forensic analysis proved these texts were sent after July 1st, after Krista was already dead. Someone had used her phone to send texts, to create a false trail, to make it look like she was alive. That someone was Chandler. He'd texted himself from his dead mother's phone, creating fake evidence, trying to support his lies. But the forensics revealed the truth. The texts were fake. Krista was dead. Chandler had killed her. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Blood in the basement, the saw with human tissue, the Google searches, the receipts, the timeline, the fake texts. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Chandler Halderson had murdered his parents, had dismembered their bodies, had scattered their remains, had tried to cover it up, had lied to police, had thought he'd gotten away with it. But he hadn't. The evidence was too strong, too clear, too damning. On July 8, 2021, after the search revealed all this evidence, Chandler Halderson was arrested, taken into custody, charged initially with hiding a corpse, mutilating a corpse, providing false information to police. The murder charges would come later, once bodies were found, once cause of death was established. But Chandler was in custody now, would never be free again. The lies had caught up to him. Not the lies about college, not the lies about SpaceX, but the lies about murder, about killing his own parents. And now he'd face justice, would face trial, would face consequences for what he'd done, for the evil he'd committed, for destroying his family. And investigators were about to find Bart and Krista, about to bring them home, about to give them the dignity Chandler had stolen. July 14, 2021. 6 days after Chandler's arrest, a man was kayaking on the Wisconsin River near Sauk City, enjoying a beautiful summer day, paddling peacefully. Then he saw something in the water, near the shore, something large, something pale, something that didn't belong. He paddled closer to investigate, and realized with absolute horror what it was. A human torso, no head, no arms, no legs, just the torso, floating, decomposing. The man immediately called 911. His peaceful day had become a nightmare, and the Chandler Halderson case had just found its first victim. Police and recovery teams responded quickly, secured the scene. The torso was carefully retrieved from the water, taken to the medical examiner's office, for identification, for autopsy, for examination. Preliminary assessment suggested it was an adult male, recently deceased, within the last 2 weeks. The timing matched. This could be Bart Halderson. DNA samples were collected immediately, would be compared to known samples, to family DNA, to missing persons databases. The results would come back quickly. and they would confirm everyone's worst fears. The DNA was a match. The torso belonged to Bart Halderson, the father who'd been missing since July 1st. The man Chandler claimed had gone to a cabin, who supposedly flew somewhere, who was supposedly on vacation. Bart hadn't gone anywhere, had been murdered, dismembered, thrown in the river, by his own son. The missing persons case had officially become a double homicide investigation, and the search for the rest of Bart and for Krista intensified immediately. The discovery changed everything, confirmed the worst, proved murder, proved dismemberment, gave investigators direction. If Bart's torso was in the river near Sauk City, where were the other parts? Where was Krista? A massive search operation began. Police, volunteers, cadaver dogs, helicopters, boats. Teams spread across Dane County and surrounding areas, searching woods, fields, rivers, anywhere Chandler might have dumped remains. The community came together, hundreds of volunteers, all looking for Bart and Krista, all wanting to bring them home. The search focused on areas Chandler had access to, places he could drive to, rural roads, remote locations, wooded areas near Windsor and surrounding towns. Investigators used cadaver dogs, specially trained to detect decomposing human remains. The dogs alerted multiple times over the next several days, in different locations. Each time, searchers found remains, pieces of Bart and Krista, scattered across the county, evidence of Chandler's systematic disposal efforts, evidence of his evil. Parts were found in forests, off dirt roads, hidden in brush, covered with leaves and debris. Chandler had tried to hide them, make them hard to find, make them disappear into nature. But the search was thorough. The dogs were effective. The volunteers were determined. And slowly, piece by piece, Bart and Krista were recovered. Arms found here, legs found there, more torso parts. The remains were scattered, separated, hidden, but being found, being brought home, being given the dignity they deserved. Krista's remains were found in multiple locations too. Like Bart, she'd been dismembered, cut into pieces, scattered, thrown away like garbage. The woman who'd given birth to Chandler, who'd raised him, who'd supported his lies for years, who'd loved him unconditionally, had been cut up and discarded by her own son. The cruelty was beyond comprehension, beyond understanding, beyond anything normal people could imagine. This wasn't just murder. This was desecration. This was evil in its purest form. The medical examiner examined all recovered remains, worked to determine cause of death. The condition of the remains made this difficult. Decomposition, dismemberment, animal activity. But enough evidence remained to establish how Bart and Krista died. Both had been shot. Gunshot wounds were evident despite decomposition. Bart shot in the back. Krista shot multiple times. Both killed by gunfire, then dismembered post-mortem. At least they'd been dead before being cut up. Small mercy, but still horrific, still unforgivable. The medical examiner confirmed that dismemberment occurred after death. The victims were already deceased when cut apart. This was slightly better than the alternative. Meant Bart and Krista didn't suffer the dismemberment, weren't alive when sawed apart. But it didn't lessen Chandler's evil, didn't make what he did any less horrific. He'd still murdered his parents, still cut them into pieces, still scattered them like trash, still treated them as less than human. The post-mortem dismemberment didn't change that. Despite extensive searching, not all remains were recovered. Some parts were never found, are still missing today, likely burned in those backyard fires, reduced to ash that dispersed, or buried somewhere so well hidden they'll never be discovered, or dissolved, or destroyed in ways investigators couldn't determine. Bart and Krista Halderson could never be fully put back together, could never be made whole. Even in death, they remained fragmented, incomplete, destroyed by Chandler's evil. The community was devastated. The details emerging from the searches, from the autopsies, from the investigation, This wasn't just murder. This was something worse, more personal, more cruel. A son had killed his parents, dismembered them, scattered them across Wisconsin, all to hide lies about college and jobs. The banality of the motive made it even worse. Such evil for such trivial reasons. People couldn't understand, couldn't process. How could someone do this? How could a son kill his parents? Over lies? Over embarrassment? Over ego? There were no answers that made sense. Just horror and grief, and the knowledge that Chandler Halderson was a monster who deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison. If you believe some people are born evil, like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The Chandler Halderson case shows how far someone will go to protect a lie. January 2022, 6 months after the murders. The trial of Chandler Halderson began in Dane County Circuit Court. Judge John Hyland presiding. The prosecution was ready, had overwhelming evidence. Blood, DNA, Google searches, receipts, witness testimony, recovered remains. Everything needed to prove Chandler killed his parents. The defense had an impossible task. Their client was obviously guilty, the evidence overwhelming, but they had to try, had to mount some defense, had to create doubt if possible. It wouldn't work, but they'd try. Prosecutor William Brown led the state's case. Methodical, professional, experienced. His job was to prove Chandler had murdered Bart and Krista, had dismembered them, had scattered their remains, had tried to cover it up. The evidence made this easy, but Brown would present it carefully, systematically, leave no doubt, ensure conviction on all counts. He opened with a powerful statement, described Chandler's web of lies, about SpaceX, about college, about job offers, explained how Bart scheduled that July 1st meeting, how Chandler couldn't let it happen, how murder became the solution. Brown told the jury this was about hiding failure, about protecting lies, about ego, about a son who valued himself more than his parents' lives. The prosecution presented evidence piece by piece, started with the lies, called witnesses who knew about Chandler's fabrications, the fake SpaceX job, the fake college enrollment, the fake insurance job offer, showed that Chandler's entire life was a lie, established motive, showed why Chandler feared exposure, why he'd kill to prevent that July 1st meeting. The witnesses were credible, their testimony damning. Chandler had been living a complete fantasy, and murder had been his solution when that fantasy threatened to collapse. Then came the physical evidence. Crime scene photos, the basement where blood was found, luminol images showing blood spatter despite Chandler's cleaning efforts. The jury saw the glowing evidence, saw proof of violence, of death, of dismemberment. The photos were disturbing, hard to look at, but necessary. The jury needed to see what Chandler had done, where he'd done it, how he'd tried to hide it. The prosecution presented the saw, the reciprocating saw with biological tissue still on the blade, with bone fragments in crevices. Forensic experts testified, explained how the tissue was human, was consistent with Bart and Krista, how the saw had been used to cut through flesh and bone, through human remains. The testimony was technical but clear. This saw had dismembered Chandler's parents, and Chandler had bought it right after killing them. The receipts proved it. The timeline proved it. Everything proved it. The Google searches were presented. Body disposal, dismemberment, cadaver dogs, DNA, all searched right after July 1st, right after the murders, right before and during disposal. The searches were time-stamped, dated, proven, showed premeditation, showed planning, showed consciousness of guilt. Chandler had researched how to commit murder and get away with it, then tried to execute that plan, but left the digital evidence behind, left proof of his crimes. The jury saw the searches, understood what they meant, understood that innocent people don't Google how to dispose of a body. Medical examiners testified about the remains, about causes of death, about the dismemberment. Dr. Linda Bieterzicki performed the autopsies. testified about what she found. Gunshot wounds on both victims. Despite decomposition and dismemberment, the evidence was clear. Bart shot in the back. Krista shot multiple times. Both killed by gunfire, then cut apart. The testimony was clinical, professional, but heartbreaking. These were real people, a real family, reduced to autopsy reports, to medical terminology, to causes of death. Because of Chandler, the prosecution called Chandler's girlfriend Kat, Catherine Mellender. She testified about their relationship, about Chandler's lies, about believing he worked at SpaceX, about believing he was finishing college, about having no idea he was lying about everything. She described seeing Chandler after July 1st, how he'd acted normal, how he'd explained his parents were at the cabin, how she'd had no reason to doubt him. She'd been living in the house with a killer, after the murders, never knowing what he'd done. The testimony established how good Chandler was at lying, at maintaining his false life, at seeming normal while hiding unspeakable evil. The prosecution called Chandler's brother Mitchell. This was devastating testimony. Mitchell had to testify against his younger brother, had to help convict him, but Mitchell chose justice, chose his parents. He described Bart and Krista, who they were, how they'd supported Chandler despite everything, how they'd believed his lies because they loved him, how they didn't deserve what happened. Mitchell broke down on the stand, cried, struggled to speak, but got through it, told the truth, helped condemn his brother, because it was the right thing to do, because Bart and Krista deserved justice. Throughout the trial, Chandler showed no emotion, no remorse, no guilt, just sat at the defense table, blank, empty, cold, like the testimony meant nothing, like his parents meant nothing, like their deaths meant nothing. The jury watched him, saw his lack of humanity, saw someone incapable of empathy, of remorse, of basic human decency. They were watching a psychopath, and they knew it. The defense tried, half-heartedly. Their strategy was weak. Argued police had tunnel vision, that they'd focused on Chandler too quickly, that they'd ignored other possibilities. But what other possibilities? The evidence all pointed to Chandler. His searches, his purchases, his lies, his DNA, his parents' blood in his house. There was no one else, no other suspect, just Chandler, and everyone knew it. The defense couldn't explain the evidence, couldn't provide alternative theories, couldn't create reasonable doubt, could only grasp at straws, and fail. The trial continued for days, witness after witness, exhibit after exhibit, the prosecution building an overwhelming case, proving beyond any doubt that Chandler Halderson had murdered his parents. The evidence was so strong, so clear, so undeniable, that conviction seemed certain. The only question was how long the jury would deliberate, how long before they returned guilty verdicts, how long before Chandler faced the consequences of his evil. Closing arguments came. Prosecutor William Brown summarized everything for the jury. The lies, the motive, the murders, the dismemberment, the cover-up, the evidence. He reminded them of the blood in the basement, the saw with human tissue, the Google searches, the receipts, the timeline, everything proving Chandler's guilt. Brown said Chandler had killed his parents rather than face the truth, rather than admit he'd been lying for years. That murder was preferable to embarrassment, to exposure, to facing consequences, that this was about ego, about narcissism, about a person so self-absorbed that his parents' lives meant nothing. Brown asked the jury to convict Chandler on all counts, to deliver justice for Bart and Krista, to ensure this monster never walked free. The defense's closing argument was weak. Attorney Catherine Dorrell tried to create doubt, suggested the investigation was rushed, that police had focused on Chandler too quickly, that they'd ignored other possibilities. But she couldn't explain the evidence, couldn't provide alternative suspects, couldn't offer reasonable explanations. Her argument rang hollow, false. The jury had seen the evidence, had heard the testimony, There was no reasonable doubt. Just a desperate attorney trying to save an obviously guilty client. The jury got the case on January 20th, 2022. They had days of testimony to consider, hundreds of exhibits to review, hours of evidence to discuss. This was a serious case. Multiple murder charges. Life in prison at stake. The jury took their responsibility seriously. They deliberated carefully, went through evidence methodically, discussed, debated, made sure. But the conclusion was obvious. Chandler Halderson was guilty. The evidence proved it beyond any doubt. After approximately 2 hours of deliberation, the jury sent word. They'd reached verdicts. 2 hours. For such a complex case. Such serious charges. This meant the jury had little to debate. Had agreed quickly. The evidence was too strong. The guilt too obvious. Chandler was brought back to court. Sat at the defense table. Showed no emotion. Just waited. The jury filed in. Took their seats. Judge Hyland asked if they'd reached verdicts. Yes. The verdicts were handed over. Reviewed. Given to the clerk to read. We the jury find the defendant, Chandler Halderson, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Bart Halderson. Guilty. The first count. The courtroom held its breath. One more count to go. We the jury find the defendant, Chandler Halderson, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Krista Halderson. Guilty. Both counts. Complete conviction. Then the other charges. Mutilating a corpse. Hiding a corpse. Providing false information. Guilty. 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 On every count. Chandler Halderson had been found guilty of murdering his parents. Of dismembering them. Of scattering their remains. Of lying to police. Of everything. The evidence had spoken. The jury had spoken. Justice was coming. Chandler showed no reaction. Just stared ahead. Empty. Blank. Like the verdicts meant nothing. Like he felt nothing. His family members cried. His brother Mitchell was devastated. Relief mixed with grief. Justice but no joy. Bart and Krista's extended family cried too. Satisfaction but sadness. Guilty verdicts didn't bring back the victims. Didn't undo the horror. Just ensured the killer would be punished. Sentencing came quickly. In Wisconsin, first-degree intentional homicide carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. No parole. No possibility of release. Life means life. Judge Hyland sentenced Chandler to life without parole for Bart's murder. Then life without parole for Krista's murder. To run consecutively, plus additional years for the other charges. Chandler Halderson would die in prison. Would never see freedom. Would spend the rest of his life behind bars for killing his parents. Before sentencing, victim impact statements were read. Mitchell spoke. About his parents. About how much he loved them. About how they'd supported Chandler despite everything. About how they didn't deserve this. About the hole in his life. About missing them every day. About the family destroyed. He was crying. Broken. But strong enough to face his brother. To tell him what he'd done. To ensure Bart and Krista were remembered. Extended family members spoke. Friends. Co-workers. Everyone describing Bart and Krista. Who they were. What they meant. What had been lost. The statements were heartbreaking. These were good people. Kind people. Hard-working people. Who'd been murdered by their own son. For lies. For ego. For reasons that made no sense to normal people. Chandler was given a chance to speak. To apologize. To show remorse. To say something. Anything. He declined. Said nothing. Offered no apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just silence. Empty. Inhuman. He accepted his sentence and was led away. To prison. Where he'd spend the rest of his life. Where he'd die. Alone. Forgotten. Punished. Chandler Halderson is in prison now. Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Maximum security. He's in protective custody. Inmates who kill their parents aren't safe in general population. He's 26 years old. Could live another 50 to 60 years. All in prison. All because he couldn't tell the truth. couldn't admit he'd been lying, couldn't face his parents with honesty, chose murder instead, and destroyed everything. People ask why. Why kill your parents over lies about college? Why not just confess? Most parents would have been disappointed but supportive, would have helped Chandler get back on track. Bart and Krista probably would have forgiven, would have helped him find a path forward. But Chandler chose murder, chose the most extreme solution, chose evil. Psychologists believe he's a narcissist, that admitting failure was worse than murder, that his ego couldn't accept being exposed as a failure, that killing his parents was preferable to admitting he was nobody. Bart and Krista Halderson deserved better, deserved a son who honored them, who appreciated their sacrifice, who valued their lives. They got Chandler instead, a narcissist, a liar, killer, someone who saw them as obstacles, as problems to eliminate, as less important than his lies. But they're not forgotten. Their lives mattered. Their deaths meant something. Their killer will never be free. That's not enough. But it's something. Rest in peace, Bart and Krista Halderson. You were good people, good parents. You didn't deserve what happened. Your son destroyed everything. But you're remembered for who you were, not for how you died, for the love you gave, the support you offered, the lives you lived. Chandler took your lives, but he couldn't take your legacy. You'll always be remembered as the victims. He'll always be remembered as the monster. Chandler Halderson will die in prison for murdering his parents. Like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Stay safe, stay aware, and I will see you in my next case.